Welcome to the final keynote address of ISLC 2021, Rebooting Resistance. We'll hear from David and Keith shortly, but before that, I would like to just remind you to stay on the call after the keynote to hear from our closing conference panel of course, Keith and David, but also Suzanne Gagnon, Nicole Ferry, and Danny Storish. I want to say how thrilled we are to host two of the most influential leadership scholars in the world, I can safely say, Keith Grint and David Collinson. For most of us, they don't really need an introduction, but let me just offer a quick recap of their contribution to the field as a way to underline just how lucky we are to be hearing their thoughts here today. So, Keith Grint has changed the way we conceptualize leadership through his problems framework and seminal books such as Leadership, Limits and Possibilities and The Arts of Leadership. Keith has also pioneered in the field by blending rich historical insights with leadership theory. His latest book on mutiny is simply a must read, and if a result of this keynote, you suddenly feel collectively radicalized with a strong urge to rebel against the status quo. This is why. Now, Keith might probably say that this is reserved, the mutiny is reserved for military organizations, but considering we also have David in this keynote, I would check myself for symptoms. So David Collinson's rich sociology work changed how we perceive and how we view power and resistance in workplace through his seminal book, Managing the Shop Floor. David has been a prolific writer throughout his career, consistently publishing in our field's top journals and with work so profoundly relevant to the moment that it stays with you and easily amalgamates with your thoughts. David is perhaps best known as someone who has pioneered a dialectical approach to leadership, but most importantly, or maybe I should say most importantly for me, he is one of those rare male scholars who speaks so powerfully about the role of gender in resistance. Now, of course, both David and Keith have been key to shaping the terrain of critical leadership studies separately and together, and most recently through their thinking on leadership romanticism. Together, David and Keith have also founded the journal Leadership and also this very conference. But enough of me talking. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about resistance. Over to you, David and Keith.
Thank you very much, Nala. Well, good afternoon, everybody. First, I'd like to say many congratulations to this year's ISLC organising team and to the Open University for hosting such an excellent online conference. There's been some really interesting, fascinating papers, and it's been a pleasure to be here. And it's wonderful to see so many of the next generation of leadership researchers producing such challenging, critical and thought-provoking presentations. When Keith and I started the conference in the journal 20 odd years ago, we were to some extent the new kids on the block, and as it were, but now we look around and realize we've become the old farts of the ISLC. How did that happen? Having said that, I'd just like to clarify that Keith is much older than I am. Just some background. Owen emailed us towards the end of November to say somebody was unwell and couldn't do the keynote speech. Could we step in? And as Nella said, Keith's written this fantastic book on mutiny and resistance, which I highly recommend. And I've done some work on resistance over the years, so we thought maybe we could bring some ideas together to provoke a discussion on these issues at the end of the conference. So it's all a little bit last minute, and we hope we find it of some interest, but we'll leave that you to be the judge of that. So I'm going to do an overview of some ideas on resistance, key themes in the area. I'll try and make some links back to some of the keynote addresses of the conference, particularly Jamie's and Helena's from yesterday, which were really excellent and are very relevant to what we've got to say today. And then I'll pass over to Keith, who will present some detailed case studies on slave rebellions and resistance in particular. So just one small segment of his fascinating book. I think it's interesting and I think quite revealing that resistance is a topic that has rarely been discussed in the conference. over the years, or even in the pages of leadership. And that in itself, highlights the fact that resistance, I would argue, is significantly under examined within our area. One of the reasons for that, of course, is the way that mainstream writers, thinkers, journalists, and managers themselves, leaders themselves, tend to respond to resistance. They tend to dismiss it. They tend to see it as a dysfunctional aspect of organizational social life, as deviant, maybe even as irrational and misguided in its response to organizational and social change. Sometimes it's been seen in the literature as a problematic obstruction to the smooth running of organizations. And for some people, it's a kind of misbehavior of a few troublemakers that need weeding out, in inverted commas. And if you look at the typical responses of leaders and managers to voices of opposition, they often try to subvert, discredit, or suppress resistance in all its forms. And if we look at the leadership studies literature itself, the mainstream literature, which covers a lot of different perspectives, I know I'm slightly homogenizing a lot of differentiated work here, it does tend to neglect or underestimate issues of both power and resistance. If you look at the leader-centered studies that tend to romanticize leaders, they frequently neglect followers altogether and therefore resistance. If you look at the post-heroic leadership literature, which looks more at distributed leadership and followers, then, distributed leadership, then you get this sense, you get the argument that, well, everyone's a leader, so there's no space for followers, so there's certainly no space for resistance, no analytical space there. Or if you there is a focus on followers in the literature, and there certainly is in the post-heroic leadership literature, there's not that much on resistance. I think Ira Chalif's work on intelligent disobedience is possibly an exception that tends to prove the rule. So what can we gain from researching resistance? Certainly we've got to go outside the parameters of leadership studies really to explore this issue. Organization studies, organizational behavior, industrial sociology, maybe even industrial relations to some extent, fortunately have engaged with this question. And what I want to suggest today, or we're suggesting today, is we can learn a great deal about leadership, organizations, and societies by exploring the views and practices of those in subordinate positions who are on the front line, who experienced the, deep-seated consequences of leaders' decisions and policies and practices. And that connects, I think that point connects very well with Jamie's excellent keynote yesterday regarding the platform workers in the food delivery industry. By his research focusing on the lived experience of being led, you can learn a lot about leadership organizations and societies. You can learn, for example, how subordinates cope with conflicting workplace pressures and demands. If anyone's ever seen the TV show Undercover Boss, then you can see how these dynamics play out. How subordinates construct more positive, more dignified identities to those that are sometimes conferred on them by organizations. How, why, and with what consequences they might resist. I'll come back to those themes. The nature of power in organizations, societies, and in leadership dynamics, and its contradictions. Resistance never emerges in a vacuum. It's always embedded in power relations. The organizational barriers to critical upward communication, of which there are many, which pressurize people to just accept the status quo, conform, comply, maybe manage impressions, but just not overtly resist. But suffice to say, what it does send a message about is that leader-follower relations are contested. They're not inherently consensual. Sometimes you would get the impression of that from the literature. They're dynamic, they're shifting, and they are open to contestation. So one message is that despite all the organizational societal pressures to conform and to comply, people do find ways to articulate dissent and enact resistance. Here's a whole list of different possibilities. I could spend the whole 15, 20 minutes talking about them, but I just want to flag up that there is a whole spectrum here of different ways that resistance, discontent can be expressed. It might be collective, it might be individual, it might be symbolic, it might be material, it might be about wages, it might be formal or informal in the way that Jamie was talking about, overt, covert, disguised, It could be very rational, or it could be quite emotional as well, or instead of. So strikes, roll distance, challenging policies. Output restriction is the one that much of management science was built on, wasn't it? Trying to overcome output restriction, or knowledge disclosure rather than knowledge restriction in whistleblowing. Jamie talked very eloquently about how social media is now being used by platform workers to find ways to harmonize, collectivize their practices. Countercultures and informal cultures, you know, even people who don't meet very often, who get a chance to have a coffee together, who can just share their experiences of the organization and realize that what they're experiencing isn't just them. It's endemic, it's more structural, it's cultural. That can be a very empowering experience, especially if the coffee's good. Humor, foot dragging. There's lots and lots of different forms of resistance. That's not really the point I want to make, other than to say that it does take multiple forms, and it can come from outside organizations as well as inside. So what do in terms of critical thinking, what can be said about leadership processes? Well, here, as I said, leadership is a contested process. So how is it that we say so little about resistance? It's quite remarkable, really. I've just quoted Keith there from his new book, from page 1. I think it's the second sentence, if I remember rightly. I did get to the second sentence, Keith. And as he quite rightly says, as soon as leadership emerges within a group, there will be resistance to that leadership. It has always been thus. It's like Grint's iron law here, you know, and I think he's quite right that leadership and resistance are very closely linked. Leaders have discretionary and hierarchical positional power in all sorts of ways, in many forms in organization. Grace, Helena, and Jamie have already talked about those in some detail, so I'm not going to go into them, but I do want to flag that up. But also to say that this power, the control that operates in organizations is rarely total, or rarely, if ever, all determining. There are frequently spaces, cracks, inconsistencies, contradictions, fissures, disjunctions in organizational social processes that can prompt or trigger forms of resistance. So I'm flagging up this inextricable linkage between power and resistance here, and they're often mutually reinforcing. So from this point of view, rather than being an irrational process, resistance can be seen as a rational way for employees to express frustration, resentment, their sense of unfairness, a sense of corruption going on in organizations, the inconsistencies between what leaders say and what they do, or what they say at one time and what they say another time. The desire to express voice, to speak, to participate, and to try and change things for the better. So this resistance can take many, many different forms. And equally, there is a whole series of different ways of theorizing resistance. Obviously, we've got the early industrial organizational sociology studies that looked at the ways that employees cope with mundane subordinated work, often through joking relations. Donald Roy's work, Alvin Gouldner's work, very, very interesting studies of particular factory situations. Labor process, critical management studies, look at management control processes, class struggle, unionization, and also the revolutionary potential or not of collective working class resistance, again, which Jamie talked about a lot yesterday. Feminist analysis, which in some ways critiques labor process theory, emphasizes the importance of gender when looking at dissent and resistance, and looks at the similarities between and differences between men's resistance, women's resistance in organizations. Women's resistance goes back a long way. Obviously, the suffragettes is a classic example. Right now, the Me Too movement is a very, very influential movement, and looking at how Me Too is influencing leadership is a really interesting area, I think, that probably needs a lot more work. But equally, feminist analysis has looked at the way that men's resistance in trade unions can sometimes have the effect of excluding or segregating women, and how, you know, male-dominated trade unions that highlight the breadwinner wage can actually have those subordinating effects on women. So there are tensions there. Post-colonial research has looked at race discrimination, slavery, the Armistead mutinies. That was a famous film, and I know Keith mentions it in his book, apartheid in South Africa, racial segregation. In the US, the civil rights movement in the 60s, black suffrage in the 60s, that's now coming back with the way that different black communities are being disenfranchised in the States right now. And more contemporarily, obviously, Black Lives Matters and the George Floyd protests last year, toppling of statues, and then most recently, perhaps the 1619 Project by the New York Times. So resistance can take many different forms. Post-structuralist analysis argues many different things, but I would select out the focus on a dialectic of control from Anthony Giddens' work and these links between power and resistance, and the way in which subordinate agency and knowledgeability need to be acknowledged within power relations and not treating them as determined. Post-structuralist analysis examines the paradoxical effects of both control and resistance, and how some forms of resistance paradoxically can reproduce prevailing power relations. Paul Willis's work comes to mind there. But it does leave open the possibility for productive dissent that can challenge and transform the status quo. Now, there are competing perspectives. I'm only flagging up a whole series of issues here just to put Keith's data into a broader context, really. That issue of the final one I mentioned then, post-structuralism, raises the question of resistance effectiveness. Are some forms of resistance more successful than others? What are the most effective forms of resistance, strategies of resistance? Is it about timing? Is it about collective support? Is it about choosing the fights you can win and not taking on fights that you're not going to win? Obviously, predicting that's not always easy, but sometimes people do seem to take on fights they can't win. In my earlier work I did back in 1994, I did look at the difference here to try and explore this question in terms of resistance through distance, looking at shop floor workers who kind of psychologically separate themselves from the workplace and deny any real interest in what's going on at work, and using Goffman's notion of distancing there, and contrasting that with resistance through persistence, which could be both inside organizations and also outside. There's some good examples of citizens resisting organizations. But here, there's much more focus on rendering leaders accountable for their decisions and challenging and ideally overturning unfair decision-making. So resistance through persistence can take many forms, but certainly I think the collective examples right now, again, of Me Too and to some extent Black Lives Matter are maybe examples of that. More recently with Suzanne Gagnon, I've written on resistance through difference, so I haven't got real time to go into that now. So that focus on the strategies of resistance raises questions about how leadership itself is about resistance. The leadership of resistance in social movements and in organizations could well be a really interesting area for more research. Again, Jamie mentioned bottom-up forms of leadership emerging in these platform workers, informal dynamics occurring below the level of the organization, really, and leaders emerging from below. And also it raises questions about leaders engaging in resistance themselves. And Heather Zoller and Gail Fairhurst wrote about that some years ago in a really good paper on resistance by leaders themselves. So there's all sorts of issues in relation to leadership and resistance. I just wanted to finish with this before passing over. And it's a slightly, he's trying to respond to some of the discussions we've had in the conference. Jean Lippman Blumen in that classic book, The Allure of Toxic Leaders, asks, why do we seek leaders? Why do we want leaders? What is the reason for our search for leaders? And also, why are we seduced by the allure of toxic leaders in particular? And she says that our need for security and certainty, which prompts us to surrender our freedom to achieve them, is a key reason. She's arguing that we're looking for reassuring authority figures to fill our parents' shoes. And that came to mind after a discussion in the Q&A with Helena yesterday morning, where search for security and certainty. The more unstable the world becomes, the more we cling to the fantasies of security that strong leaders appear to provide. So that raises this question of security. It could take many different forms: existential, about your body, about being alive. It could be economic, about wages. It could be symbolic, about your identity and your dignity. It could be all of those. But the issue there is that the more we search for security, the more we often leads us to conform or comply or just engage in distancing forms of resistance. My experience of doing research in this area suggests that where resistance is more effective, it typically requires a great deal of courage, great deal of determination and persistence, and can involve considerable costs and risks. And it involves an acceptance of a certain degree of insecurity. I don't think we can escape from that. And that's for both collectives and individuals. And I think Keith's work here is really instructive, where he's talking about where slaves are commodities who are bought and sold, where power is particularly brutal, coercive, and existential. And yet, even in these conditions, resistance in these most asymmetrical of power relationships still emerges. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Dave. Can you put on the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm going to look at these different kinds of resistance. This comes out of some work, partly from the book. The first one is about the Mutiny book, but the other ones are really more to do with the work I'm currently doing, just looking at resistance generally, and in particular on slave resistance. For this section, I'm going to look at slave resistance in two areas. One is Jamaica, and the other one is Saint-Domingue, or what came to be known as Haiti. So the first one's a British slave colony, and the second one's a French slave colony. So mutiny, first of all, then everyday dissent, and then refusal to work, suicides, runaways, Maroons, rebellions, and we'll end with revolutions. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the first one. We'll start with the mutinies. So about 10% of all the slave ships that went across from Africa primarily to the Caribbean area, about 10% of those had some kind of rebellion. About 30% of the slave people who were enslaved died en route. It was common for enslaved women to be involved in rebellions, often because they were separated from men. Sometimes they were unchained, and that gave them a different leverage of power over it. I'll just give you one example of what a mutiny might look like and where it might go. So in 1841, the American brig the Creole was transporting slaves from Richmond to New Orleans, 135 slaves, 10 crew and a few passengers, including the captain's wife. And on board the ship, one of the slaves was a man called Madison Washington, and he escaped from Virginia to Canada, and then he returned to free his still enslaved wife in Virginia. He got recaptured, and then he is sent on this ship. So they're at sea for 7 days. On the 7th of November, 1841, they're about 130 miles north of the Bahamas. And Washington, the slave Washington, broke out, and he persuades, threatens, 11 fellow slaves in the area where he is that they need to join him in the mutiny, or else he's going to kill them all. So they join him. They break out. The Captain Ensor, then attacks them. He's killed, as was a guard. And the intent of the slaves, when they've taken over the ship, originally is to sail to the free colony of Liberia, which has been set up ironically, by the United States as a free colony of ex-slaves. But the navigator, the white navigator, Merritt, persuades them that if they don't kill him, he'll take them to freedom. He'll navigate their way to freedom, but not to Liberia because it's too far. They don't have enough supplies. And then another slave, Ben Blacksmith, suggests they should sail to the Bahamas, because it has become rumored that if you can get to the Bahamas, which were British owned, and at this point in time, slavery has been abolished. If you can get to the Bahamas, then because there's no slavery in British territory, you will be free. So, and he also says if we don't get there in 3 days, they'll kill the rest of the crew, because it's been quite common for slave ships to be sailed by white slavers and then sailed in different directions, and they never get free. Anyway, this ship arrives in the Bahamas. Most of the slaves are freed, but the 19 original mutineers are arrested while the US is trying to argue for the return of the ship and the return of all the slaves. There's a huge court case about this. Eventually, the British court decides that to free the mutineers, it argues that the killings of the slavers were legitimate in their self-defense. And then it ultimately ends with Washington traveling to Sierra Leone. So there's a successful mutiny on board a slave ship. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Second form of resistance is quotidian dissent, so everyday dissent. James Scott, in a fabulous book, calls these the weapons of the weak. And some of these things Dave is always talking about: foot dragging, dissimulation, false compliance, pilfering, feigned ignorance, slander, arson, sabotage, and so forth. And there's a quote here from a white slave merchant in Demerara. He talked about the habit of the slaves of making you put a question twice in order to gain time for framing an answer, such as they wish to give. Third form of resistance is simply a refusal to work. This is actually quite a common form of negotiation. The biggest one that I've come across is the eve of the Jamaican Rebellion. So 27th of December, 1831. This is on the eve of the ending of slavery. So the 60,000 enslaved people in Jamaica refused to go back to work after the Christmas period. They have been told, this is false, they've been told that the British king has promised them freedom, and the slave owners have buried all the information and ignoring it. And it's actually not true. We'll come back to the Jamaican Rebellion in a minute. It's not successful. Next slide, please. So the fourth form of resistance is suicide. It's actually quite common for slaves to commit suicide rather than go all the way across and then become enslaved in their plantations. So as an example, 10th of June, 1796, 4 enslaved men on a slave ship broke free. They attempt to overpower the crew. 2 of them are killed in a fight. And then the other 2 jump straight overboard because they know what's coming to them. And some of their revenge of the slavers is just quite disgusting. But what's interesting is how the slave owners treated this form of resistance and the suicide of the 2 other slavers. At the end of the day, in the ship's log, the entry said, "The weather ends pleasant." So absolutely nothing about what had just happened. And then this picture is Turner's very famous slave ship. This is a picture of the Zong, which was registered in Liverpool, left Accra in Ghana in 1781. That's 442 enslaved passengers, which is twice the normal, heading for Jamaica. In December of that year, the water supplies appear to be low. There's a dispute about this, and there's significant sickness on board. So the captain, Luke Collingwood, he orders 54 women and children straight into the sea. And the following day, he orders 42 men to be thrown overboard into the sea. And the next day, 10 of the enslaved people that are still on board, they threw themselves into the sea because they know what's coming. 3 weeks later, just 208 of the original 442 enslaved people disembark in Jamaica. And the Gregson Shipping Syndicate in Liverpool, these are the owners, they demand £30 a head for each of the 133 enslaved people who have been chucked overboard from the insurance company. So this is treating people simply as property. There's a huge legal dispute about whether, in fact, this is legally right. It's not about morality, it's about legally right. In the end, Gregson loses the case. And this is one of the famous cases that is used by some of the abolitionists to explain why the slave trade has to stop. Next one, thank you. So the fifth approach is just runaways. Again, this is quite common. Sometimes slaves didn't run away forever. They ran away for a few hours or a few days. They quite often sent notes back saying they would return, but only under certain conditions. So it was a negotiating tactic. Sometimes they didn't return. A picture at the bottom is Toussaint Louverture from Haiti, Saint-Domingue. He ran away from his own plantation, the Breda plantation, in 1772. He's away for 2 months before he's recaptured. Then there's a kind of settling of accounts. The following year, many of the enslaved people who are still on the Breda plantation, they run away in response to a new manager called Del Ribo. So Del Ribo, what he does is he detains Lewis, who's a slave responsible for mules. He accuses him of poisoning the mules and he tortures him in front of all the other slaves. And then Lewis tries to commit suicide by slashing his own throat with a broken bottle. The next day, 25 slaves ran away and they refused to return until this man, the slave overseer, has mended his ways. So he basically whips another slave and then another 36 abscond. And then Toussaint is then persuaded to go find the runaways and persuade them to return, which he does so on the promise that Del Ribo will mend his ways. And actually, Del Ribo is dismissed. He's not dismissed for cruelty, he's dismissed for his poor financial performance. So there's an issue here about what happens is if you treat slaves in a worse way than normal, they don't necessarily respond positively. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the sixth way of resisting is Maroons. It's probably from the French word marron, meaning fugitive or feral. It's very common in Jamaica rather than quite so much in Saint-Domingue. So there are two Maroon Wars, which ex-slaves fought with the British, 1728 to 40, 1795, 9. So a long period of warfare. And because the British can't overcome these people who've set up basically independent areas in Jamaica, they allow them to form legal independent townships. So the big deal is we won't try and get you back into slavery as long as you don't start raiding the rest of the plantations or trying to encourage rebellion. That's basically the deal. The consequence of the deal, apart from the fact that you get several Maroon townships set up, is it actually makes rebellion more difficult for the rest of the slaves who are not Maroons, because it skims off the potential rebel leaders. And the Maroons also then supply trackers and mercenary troops to help put down future slave rebellions. So it's viable for the Maroons, but it makes it much more difficult for the Jamaican rebels to become successful. So the seventh one is actually rebellions itself. This is just the Jamaican rebellions. Very famous, two very famous big ones. The first one's 1760, so-called Tacky's War. 13 executed, 33 transported. 1799, big rebellion, 1,000 slaves are transported. They basically go to South America, to an even worse area. 1803 rebellion, 2 executed. 1806, 1 executed, 1 transported. And you see a list of the rebellions that occur there. So almost constantly, there's always somebody trying to rebel. The biggest rebellion of all is the 1831 rebellion. Sometimes it's called the Baptist War, because they some of the white Baptist ministers were involved in this. They were accused of trying to provoke rebellion. Anyway, in the actual battles of that rebellion, 200 rebels are killed, 2,000 are executed in the field afterwards, so there's no trial, they just executed them. About 14 whites were killed, and afterwards about 750 rebels were tried, and about 312 executed. And then 2 years later, slavery is abolished. And that's not a coincidence. I think there's a really important point here, that one of the reasons that slavery does get itself abolished is because even the greatest proponents of slavery, i.e. Jamaican slave owners, have recognized that something has to give, that you can't keep doing this, because all you do is you just provoke rebellions one after the other. So it's not as if you get the abolition of slavery just because there are some abolitionists in the UK or Britain trying to do good works. It's actually because the pro-slavery lobby have realized that the game is up. And the last slide, please. So the last one is revolution itself. And this is really based upon this question. So why did Saint-Domingue, or became Haiti, succeed where Jamaica failed? There are lots of reasons why this might be the case. The first one, I think, is the role of the navies involved. So the British Royal Navy never cedes control over the Caribbean and frequently defeats the French Navy. So when the French Navy are trying to put down slave revolts in Haiti, the British Royal Navy won't let them through. So that there's good reason. This is ironic, because the British Royal Navy also tries to reimpose slavery on Haiti. So it's not as if they're pro-liberation, they're just anti-French. Second one is the French Revolution, Declaration of the Rights of Man. So this occurs just before the Saint-Domingue rebellions, and there are several of those. And I think what the Rights of Man does is generate this ideological legitimacy to the Haitian rebels. And it also undermines the support from the French state. So there are always some French revolutionaries who are anti-slavery, even though quite a few of them are pro-slavery. But the consequence of that wavering support is that you never get this uniformly antagonistic approach that the British state had to the Jamaican rebels. The French state could not quite work out whether it wanted to stop slavery or reimpose it. Now, the French state has 3 different enemies in Haiti: the white plantation owners, a very large mixed race group, and the enslaved black population. And it never gets the allegiance of any of those groups. They're always fighting each other, and the French state is fighting those 3 groups at different times. So there's always this contestation. Whereas in Jamaica, The British state is always on the side of the white plantation owners, and it uses the Maroons as mercenaries against the rebels. Fifth, the French state basically bankrupts itself via its poor taxation system and its support for the American Revolution and then Napoleon's imperialism, whereas the British state is never quite that badly bankrupted, or at least financially stretched. The sixth one is interesting. This is what Nietzsche calls in his On the Genealogy of Morality, slave morality. So Nietzsche, one of Nietzsche's arguments against Christianity is he talks about the way that people in subordinate positions end up generating a kind of culture of impotence. So it kind of inverts the morality of the other. In effect, what Christians did, as far as Nietzsche is concerned, is they took the fact that they have no power. He's not talking about the upper class, he's talking about working class people. They don't have any power, but they turn that absence of power into some kind of good. So it's good not to be oppressive. It's good not to have lots of riches, because ultimately your reward will be in heaven. And Nietzsche's argument, this is just a balm for the weak, and it actually undermines the ability of people to resist. Whereas what Toussaint Louverture and the rebel leaders in Haiti do is they don't adopt this slave morality in Nietzsche's terms. What they adopt is the French revolutionary culture. So they are constantly reiterating the notion that this is about, in their terms, brotherhood. This is about equality. This is about freedom. So they never get that kind of inverted logic that Nietzsche warned about. Seventh, the Haitian rebels are actually better at recruiting a heterogeneous network than the Jamaican rebels. So when the French tried to reimpose slavery, they do this a couple of times, what the Haitian rebels work out very quickly is there isn't much point in trying to resist French professional soldiers, because they will beat you in a fair fight. They're just too well armed and too well organized, and there's too many of them. But you don't need to do this. All you need to do is withdraw to the inner parts of the island and wait for yellow fever and cholera and anything else to kill off the French soldiers. And that's what they do. This is one of the kind of initials of guerrilla warfare. So something like 80% of all the French soldiers sent to Haiti died from some kind of medical problem. They didn't die from combat. Eighth, Jamaica's got more absentee owners than Haiti, so there's a greater reliance on local white and black militia and the Maroons. And finally, Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines, they're both revolutionaries. Dessalines is the guy that replaces Toussaint Louverture eventually. When Dessalines takes over, so Toussaint Louverture is trying to retain white support. He wants the end of slavery, but he doesn't want to remove French control. He doesn't want to remove the French population. But when the French come back after Toussaint is captured, when the French come back and trying to reimpose slavery, they also organize wide-scale massacres of some of the temporarily free people. And when Dessalines takes over, he imposes a similar kind of brutality and massacres very large numbers of French white slavers and civilians. And we'll end on the two different flags at the bottom. So the left-hand side is the French revolutionary flag. And what Dessalines does in a very public statement is tear out the white section of the French flag and sew it together again. And on that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much for such a wonderful recap of how we could think about resistance, and in places heart-wrenching examples of how resistance can be enacted. I have so many questions, and I'm sure our audience too, so I will invite them to either type in their questions in the Q&A pane or to raise their hands. And whilst they ponder their questions, I wanted to ask Keith, first you. In your book, you say that recognizing injustice does not automatically translate into rebellion unless there is a clear picture, clear path to freedom. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about who is to provide such a path. Is this a role for leaders, or is this a more collective process, where we all collectively recognize that we need a particular type of freedom?
A good question. I think my reading of this is that sometimes this alternative, I think the point I'm trying to make is if there isn't an alternative, people just don't rebel. So there's no point in rebelling if you're not going to have any chance of success. People don't rebel when things are bad. They rebel usually when two things happen. One is there's a possibility of improving wherever you are, and there's a way of doing this. So that also explains how whistleblowing works. We know that in contemporary organizations, lots of things quite often go wrong, but people don't whistleblow unless they think that whistleblowing will make a difference. And they also know that when they whistleblow, things will happen to them that will make their lives changed forever. So this is a really interesting issue about where does the spark come from for people to rebel? And at the end of the Mutiny book, I talk about a character from history called puer robustus, which is the kind of naughty child argument, which is used by quite a lot of writers. Marx uses it, for example. In Marx's terms, the kind of puer robustus is somebody who is an inveterate rebel who will pick up some of these ideas and recognize that this is not right and there is a different way of doing this, and I'm going to lead this or try to stimulate it, knowing that I might not survive this. So it's a really unusual character. There are other people that argue that this, like Hobbes, for example, Thomas Hobbes argues that the puer robustus is a real problem for everybody because they unsettle organizations and they generate anarchy. So these are people that should never be supported or encouraged. So in terms of where does the spark come from? Is it individual? Is it collective? I think it's just different. I think there are sometimes individuals that make a stand, and then other people copy them or join them. And there are existing organizations which already have an alternative. So if you think, for example, one of the arguments I make in the Mutiny book is that if you look at the mutinies of the Russians in the First World War in 1917, I mean, their conditions are much worse the previous 100 years in the Russian army. They're much worse, but they don't rebel until they have the beginnings of an alternative idea, which comes in from all the left-wing political parties in Russia at the time. Not just the Bolsheviks, but the socialist revolutionaries and all kinds of people are there, say there's an alternative here and we can do something about it. So I think in those conditions, that would be a collective stimulus rather than an individual stimulus.
Yeah, it sounds like, I'm sorry, my computer's playing up. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, I can't hear you. Just a moment.
And she was never seen again. Oh, she's back.
Sorry.
I'm here as a backup if you need it. Oh no, you're back. We can see you perfectly.
Yeah, we can see
you.
you.
Yes, but you can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Perfectly.
I can't hear you. That's the problem.
Okay, I can come in then at this point.
Yes, please.
If that helps.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting presentation, both. I was thinking, I was thinking I was going to ask a question about material conditions and whether one lesson from Keith is that if things have to get so particularly bad as to sort of encourage a mutiny, but I think you've kind of answered that by saying that you need these kind of structures of hope and that things can get better. So I was just wondering, and that to me speaks really clearly over to what David was saying as well about resistance leadership. So my question is really to try to feed across both of your contributions and to think, having heard what one another has said in this presentation, if that's given each of you a slightly different take or a slightly different food for thought.
I'm back, by the way. Just to say.
Hey.
Well, I think we roughly knew what each of us was going to say, so we had sort of shared it in advance. So I kind of knew what Keith was going to say, apart from the real detail. So no, I suppose is the answer.
I think one of the things that I hadn't thought about until I actually saw David's slides just now was the picture of the on the fourth slide. You've got a picture of and the title is Sabotage.
Oh yeah.
And I was just thinking about in terms of sabotage on slave societies and in mutinies, that you quite often don't get evidence of that because there isn't any evidence. I mean, it's not just the fact that history is about the history of winners. It's not just that. It's just that many of these things that we would call sabotage are never reported. That's the whole point about sabotage, is you don't report it. So there's this huge under the surface stuff going on all the time by all kinds of people that we're not simply aware of. What we are aware of is what comes to us. But if we don't get to hear about this or read about it, then you never know what was going on. So the notion that it's a bit like kind of old arguments that the presence of or the absence of dissent doesn't mean you have a consensus.
Yeah.
It just means that people are not willing to overtly dissent.
Yes. And I was saying, well, leadership studies hasn't looked at resistance, but to be fair, building on what Keith just said there, it isn't easy to research. It is, a lot of it is concealed, it's disguised, and it requires building up really good trusting relationships with research respondents to get them to open up in the way that Jamie described in his study yesterday is a good example. Because the penalties for resistance can be so severe. Keith's examples in the case of slaves clearly illustrate that. But even in everyday organizations, the worry that if you put your head above the parapet, as it were, and nobody follows you, then your career could be ruined, for example. You might have to leave. The penalties for the perception of penalties, as well as the penalties, can be very disciplinary, and it from a research point of view can make researching resistance a challenge.
Maybe there's an argument here for a kind of a more action research orientation or a sort of workers' inquiry approach. Potentially to help, have a more proactive role for researchers in resistance leadership. Anyway, Nelly, you're back. So
yes, I'm back. Sorry about that glitch. My various headphones are connecting to my computer. Just linking to what you just said, David, Carlos Azevedo posed a really good question, and it really links well to this discussion we had so far. He said, David mentioned, where resistance is more effective, it involves the acceptance of a certain degree of insecurity and uncertainty. And is that something that we need to embrace? When we resist, you said yourself, if you rebel and nobody follows you,
Yeah. I think that's just my take on it. And it was just responding really to the debate with Helena yesterday, because Helena was saying what we need to do is find alternative spaces of security in order to resist. And I'm not sure. So I was really problematizing that point she made and thinking that actually when I look at cases of resistance that have been effective in organizations, in research studies I've done, people have had to embrace insecurity. If they'd gone for a safe option, then they wouldn't have won the case. They wouldn't have changed the decision making and made a transformative impact in the organization. So it seems to me that we need to have a different orientation to insecurity and security.
Yeah, well, it's risky. It's a risky business.
Yeah, exactly. Like giving a keynote with 2 weeks' notice is a risky business,
Pretty. You're doing really well, though. There's a question from Julia, presumably for both of you. Do you think the latest UK police crime sentence and court bill will have a greater impact on ethnic minorities and women due to the removal of many non-violent protest rights? In brackets, the King Center USA promotes non-violent actions. People who need to protect would tend to be from groups who are outside the traditional powers. And to Julia, this encourages violent action, which then removes the more moral high ground normally associated with these similar to Bible examples given. Does any one of you want to?
I think it's a really interesting question, and some of the work I've been looking at on resistance is about the rise of the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s. And you can see a similar kind of ploy about the removal of certain rights. But the trick is not to fall into the assumption that you're looking at the same thing, because you're not looking at the same thing. So I think it's too, there are two different responses. One is it's too facile to say this is the equivalent of the beginning of a slippery slide down to a very authoritarian state, though that might be the case. And the other point is you really have to be extraordinarily wary of what the government is trying to do. And I kind of remember what happened to, well, one of the reasons Mrs. Thatcher fell from power in the UK was her adoption of the poll tax, which wasn't about the removal of rights, but it stimulated mass dissent and huge protests across the country for weeks and weeks, and that led to her being removed. So the fact that the law says you can't do this doesn't necessarily mean people don't do it. I mean, I think the whole point of Martin Luther King's arguments about civil resistance and Mahatma Gandhi in a similar kind of way is that what you have to do at some point is take a moral point, a stand against the law and saying, I am now going to dissent from the law. And the law says I can't protest, but I'm going to protest. And then we'll see what will happen after that. So that, again, this is linked into an argument about A, bravery, and B, about tactics, or strategy. What is the most useful response to this kind of action? And I think at this point, I don't know the answer to that question. And very often nobody knows the answer until it starts to deploy. And then you see what happens. And then things change. I'm kind of reminded of the kind of disinterest of the British people in what was happening in Syria a few years ago. That many people were not that. Syria was a far off place. And the civil war was nothing to do with the Brits. And all of a sudden you get a photograph of a 2-year-old drowned on a beach. And all of a sudden, everyone is thinking, this is terrible. We should do something about this. So I think there's an intriguing issue here about how quickly popular opinion can be switched around under certain circumstances. And just because the government, I mean, knowing this government, it won't even get this right, never mind anything else right. So I'm not necessarily pessimistic in the sense that this is the beginning of the end of some kind of liberal society and a slippery slope down to an authoritarian state. I don't think the current government could organize anything. So on that sense, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to remove this stuff and move on or backwards.
Thank you, Keith.
It's interesting that tonight in the Commons, there's going to be a big resistance by the Conservative backbenchers to the latest government policies on COVID, isn't there? You know, the right wingers are up in arms about it. So there's going to be the biggest resistance movement in this Parliament's history. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
It's kind of interesting picking up on that. So that resistance is based upon the assumption that somehow Britain is a liberal state and we don't go round showing papers to people. That's not how we're not a police state. And yet the same government is trying to bring in legislation to mean that if you want to vote, you have to show your papers. Yeah. So the whole thing is just extraordinarily hypocritical. But
yeah, it is. I agree. Another question for Keith. Thank you from Johan Alves. Thank you for a really interesting expose. I'm curious as to how you'd want to connect this to leadership. If you'd like to do that, of course. Rebellion against leadership, rebellion as leadership, or rebelling rebellious leaders?
Yeah, I think all of those. So if you look at the details of, in this case, the Jamaican and the Haitian rebellions, what's really interesting is the very different approaches to leadership taken by different individuals. So Toussaint Louverture has a very different approach to leadership to Dessalines. Dessalines is very much a kind of Jacobin and absolutely ruthless, and Toussaint is not. And then the Jamaican rebellions, I think the leadership of the people at the head of the Jamaican rebellions are not trying to overthrow slavery. Certainly in the last rebellion, that they think that they've been promised freedom. And if that's not the case, what they want is a few more days off. So they're not revolutionary in the same way that the Haitian rebels were revolutionary. So there are different formats of leadership involved. And if you know anything about Haiti in particular, it becomes very, there's lots of internecine battles within the enslaved groups about how they should operate and what they should do. And one of the things that makes you quite despondent is that once they've got their freedom, once the French have given up trying to enslave them, their problem is that they don't know whether the French are going to come back and try to re-enslave them, or the British will then invade and re-enslave them. And the only way they can stop this happening is by having a large military force permanently in place. And the only way they can afford that is if they keep the plantations going and they just make all the slaves into wage laborers. So most of the slaves want to go away, find a piece of land, and just become self-sufficient. But the Haitian rebel leaders say, we can't do that. If we do that, we'll have no army. So we have to have an army to protect you. And to have the army, we have to keep the wage labor going. So you'll be staying in the same place on the same plantation. We'll pay you instead of enslaving you, but you won't get a huge amount of freedom beyond that. And it's massively despondent for, I think, many of the people that they thought they were engaging in a revolution to free themselves. And instead what they get is wage labor, not what they revolted for.
Thanks, Keith. So many questions are coming in. I was wondering if David could reflect a little bit more on resistance, and I will try to make this into a three-pronged question. So some of the most prominent resistance movement, just to put us back into the 21st century, some of the most prominent resistance movements of our time seem to be either led by women or have women, as a majority, overwhelming majority in them. And I'm not talking only about social justice movements such as those for gender and racial equality that you mentioned, David, but also, climate crisis movements, anti-development movements, such as those against land enclosures in Latin America, or, those against financialization of economy. And I was just wondering what such state of affairs tells you, from the perspective of theorizing resistance for such a long time. What does it tell you about the crisis that we find ourselves in? What does it tell you about leadership? And relatedly, what about resistance?
Well, it's a really well put point, I think. There's been quite a lot of discussion through the pandemic about the emergence of women leaders in different political contexts and different societies, and obviously the relative success compared to some of the men leaders in dealing with the pandemic. But what you're pointing to there is it's really interesting that actually you're starting to see the emergence of female women leaders in opposing in social movements particularly, and in finding new ways to resist. So that's great. I hadn't really thought that through, but I think that's very heartening, and I think that could lead to potentially really effective forms of resistance. I think where men and women are working together and balancing each other, they can operate really well. And with women in leadership roles, I think that would be terrific. So I think I don't know what you mean by in terms of the crisis. Which crisis did you mean?
Well, all these, development crisis and climate crisis, and the even the crisis of capital,
Yes, yeah.
trying to reinvent itself.
Well, it goes back to my point about Me Too. I do think that the impact of Me Too on leadership generally and on gender relations broadly is very powerful, and I think it is having a transformative effect. I mean, you've got two paradoxical processes operating simultaneously. You've got the Me Too movement, and I think making a lot of leaders and managers rethink gender and sexuality in organizations. But alongside that, paradoxically, we've got this reemergence of all these strong man leaders in different
right-wing movements, especially.
And in the Republican movement in the States, you've got this really strong reassessment or restatement of masculinity as a positive force, regardless of how it is enacted. I noticed Tucker Carlson the other day was trying to argue that Boris Johnson had lost his masculinity through the pandemic, and he was interviewing Nigel Farage at the time. But so bizarrely, they are trying to reassert what we might call traditional forms of masculinity. At the same time that there are these gender transformations going on. So you've got these two countervailing processes occurring simultaneously. So you could, in terms of leadership, you could say there are two particular impacts that are almost alongside each other, and that are in contradiction to each other, really. But I do think that in terms of some of the examples that in that strategies of resistance paper, the example that I gave of resistance through persistence was a collaboration between women in the trade union movement, in the insurance company, and I do think there's a tremendous potential there for women to resist in potentially really effective ways.
Yeah, it seems that women are not veering or gravitating any longer towards resistance through distance. It's quite more overt. But unfortunately, I have to cut this lovely discussion short. It's time for our concluding panel of the evening, and maybe we can transfer some of these or continue some of these discussions in the panel. Thank you both, Keith and David, so much for such a wonderful presentation, and thank you to our participants for brilliant questions.
Thank you, Ella, for your sharing. Really good. Thank you.
Over to you.